Picture this. You are the beloved founding father of a young, fledgling nation. You are leading armies, negotiating life-or-death treaties, and literally posing for the portrait that will eventually end up on the $1 bill. But every time you open your mouth, you are hiding a terrifying, spring-loaded torture device made of hippopotamus ivory, brass screws, heavy lead, and, brace yourself for this one, actual human teeth. That is right, you heard me correctly. I need you to take that sweet, cozy elementary school myth about the wooden teeth and throw it right out the window. And if that is not enough to absolutely shatter your childhood history lessons, what if I told you that in his youth, this supposedly perfect, flawless hero accidentally triggered an entire world war? Forget that nonsense story about the boy chopping down a cherry tree who could never tell a lie. The truth about this first president is far saltier, much bloodier, and infinitely more fascinating than anything you ever read in your high school textbooks. Welcome, comrades who have landed at BrainBoost English Podcast. Pull up a chair, take a sip of freezing cold iced tea, and imagine you are standing in the middle of a freezing, miserable military camp at Valley Forge in the late 1770s. The snow is blindingly white. The winter wind is howling and chilling you straight to the bone. Your pathetic dinner is a piece of salted pork as tough as a leather shoe sole, and your tall, imposing commanding general is secretly holding his face inside his tent, crying in absolute agonizing pain from severe gingivitis. History is not just a collection of boring dates and dusty old statues. History is a messy, hilarious, and sometimes downright bizarre human drama. And today, we are ripping the glorious mask off the ultimate American icon. We are diving deep into the spectacular failures, the incredibly lucky escapes, and the very human reality of George Washington. Let us rewind the clock and start with a chapter of his life that history teachers conveniently gloss over. Let us call this chapter the Oopsie World War. When we picture George Washington, we usually think of a wise old man with powdered white hair looking very serious. But in his early 20s, young George was basically an incredibly ambitious, slightly arrogant, and highly inexperienced kid trying to make a name for himself in the British colony of Virginia. He was hungry for glory, he wanted a commission in the regular British Army, and he was desperate to prove he was a tough guy. In 1754, the British and the French were engaged in a very tense, very passive-aggressive standoff over the Ohio River Valley. Both empires wanted this incredibly valuable land. The British governor of Virginia decided to send a messenger to politely but firmly tell the French to pack up their bags and get off their lawn. And who did he pick for this incredibly delicate diplomatic mission? Yes, you guessed it. 22-year-old George Washington. Talk about sending a boy to do a man's job. Washington marched into the wilderness with a small group of militia and some Native American allies. The situation was a powder keg, and young George was walking around holding a lit match. He stumbled upon a small French encampment hidden in a rocky gorge called Jumonville Glen. Now, exactly who shot first is still a subject of massive historical debate, but instead of walking in with a white flag and a polite letter, Washington's men ambushed the French camp. The skirmish lasted about 15 minutes. The French commander, a diplomat named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was captured. He tried to explain through an interpreter that he was on a peaceful diplomatic mission, basically saying, "Hey, I am just the messenger." But before the situation could be de-escalated, one of Washington's Native American allies, a powerful leader known as the Half-King, stepped forward and brutally assassinated the French diplomat right in front of Washington. Young George completely lost control of the situation. He was entirely in over his head. When the French authorities found out that their diplomat had been murdered in cold blood during a time of peace, they were absolutely furious. This single chaotic blunder in the woods sparked a massive conflict known as the French and Indian War in North America. But it did not stop there. The conflict rapidly escalated across the Atlantic Ocean, creating a massive snowball effect that dragged all the major European powers into the 7 Years' War. It was the first true global conflict, with fighting taking place in Europe, India, and the Americas. So, yes, your first president's first major achievement was accidentally pressing the red button and starting a world war. Everyone messes up at their first job. Maybe you spill coffee on the printer, but George Washington literally set the globe on fire. Break Euro. Despite this spectacular international disaster, Washington somehow kept failing upwards. A couple of decades later, the American colonies decided they had enough of British taxes and declared independence. The Continental Congress needed to choose a commander-in-chief to lead a newly formed, incredibly disorganized rebel army against the British Empire, which was the most powerful, heavily armed superpower on the face of the earth at that time. It was like a group of angry toddlers picking a fight with a professional heavyweight boxer. So, how did Washington get the job? Was he the most brilliant tactical genius alive? Not exactly. He showed up to the Continental Congress every single day wearing a tailored, incredibly fancy military uniform. He was essentially practicing the ultimate modern career advice. Dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Furthermore, he was extremely tall for his era, standing at an impressive 6 feet and 2 inches. In the 18th century, people were generally much shorter, so Washington looked like an absolute giant. He looked the part of a hero, so they gave him the job. Break woes. But looking like a hero and fighting like one are two very different things. During the American Revolutionary War, Washington's absolute greatest talent was not crushing his enemies on the battlefield. Actually, he lost a shocking number of battles. The defense of New York was a complete and utter disaster. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and almost completely annihilated. But Washington possessed a unique and incredible superpower. He was the undisputed, undefeated master of the strategic retreat. He was a genius at running away. Time after time, just when the British thought they had him trapped and were ready to crush the rebellion once and for all, Washington would pull off a miraculous escape under the cover of night or hiding behind dense fog, smuggling his battered, freezing, shoeless soldiers across rivers to safety. He realized very quickly that he did not actually have to beat the British army in a head-to-head fight. That would be suicide. He only had to keep his own army from being destroyed. He just had to survive. He had to be annoying enough for long enough until the British public simply got tired of paying for an expensive war across the ocean. It was an exhausting, humiliating, and desperate strategy, but it required nerves of absolute steel. He was leading a group of starving, sick men who constantly wanted to quit and go home, but his sheer stubborn refusal to surrender is what kept the American dream alive. So, he survived the World War he started, and he survived running away from the British Empire for 7 years. But wait until you hear the truth about his personal life, the horrific reality of his smile, and the shocking way he decided to drop the microphone on the entire political system. Let us talk about the lies we have all been spoon-fed since elementary school. If you ask a random person on the street what they know about George Washington, they will probably tell you the famous story about a young George chopping down his father's prized cherry tree. When confronted, little George supposedly looked up with big, innocent eyes and declared, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet." It is a beautiful, heartwarming story about integrity and honesty. It is also completely and utterly fabricated. It is fake news from the 19th century. This ridiculous piece of historical fiction was entirely made up by an opportunist and book peddler named Mason Locke Weems, who wrote a highly exaggerated biography of Washington shortly after his death to make a quick buck. He knew that people were desperate for a flawless, mythical hero, so he gave them exactly what they wanted. he transformed a complicated, flesh and blood human being into a boring, perfect saint. But if you want to know the absolute grimmest, most uncomfortable truth about George Washington, we have to talk about his mouth. The most persistent rumor about our first president is that he wore a set of wooden teeth. Again, this is completely false. Wood would have rotted, splintered, and turned into a mushy, foul-smelling disaster inside a human mouth. The actual truth about Washington's dental hygiene is straight out of a Gothic horror movie. Throughout his life, Washington suffered from excruciating, agonizing dental problems. By the time he was inaugurated as the first president of the United States, he had exactly one of his original natural teeth left in his head. The reason his teeth fell out was not just poor hygiene. Every time he got sick with malaria or smallpox, 18th century doctors would prescribe a trendy, popular medicine called calomel. The primary ingredient in calomel was mercury. Yes, you heard that correctly. His doctors were essentially poisoning him with toxic heavy metals, which systematically destroyed his gums and caused his teeth to literally fall out of his skull. To solve this catastrophic problem, Washington employed the most advanced dental prosthetics money could buy at the time. And by advanced, I mean absolute nightmare fuel. His custom-made dentures were constructed from a bizarre and macabre combination of materials. The base was carved from thick, heavy hippopotamus ivory and elephant ivory. Attached to this ivory base were teeth sourced from cows, horses, and tragically enslaved human beings. He literally bought teeth from the people he enslaved to be implanted into his own dentures. These various teeth were held together by a complicated, painful system of heavy brass screws, lead pipes, and stiff metal springs. Imagine putting a heavy, metallic bear trap inside your mouth. Because of the stiff springs holding the upper and lower plates together, the dentures constantly wanted to pop open. To keep his mouth shut, Washington had to physically clench his jaw with significant muscular force at all times. If he relaxed his face for even a second, his mouth would aggressively spring open. This is the real reason why George Washington always looks so incredibly stern, grumpy, and unsmiling in all of his famous portraits and on the $1 bill. He was not striking a majestic, stoic pose for the ages. He was desperately clenching his jaw so his terrifying, spring-loaded fake teeth would not fly out of his face and land in the painter's lap. He lived in constant throbbing pain. His gums were permanently swollen, and his dentures smelled absolutely horrific because the porous ivory would soak up wine and food stains. Despite his chronic pain and his desire to just go home and farm his land, the newly formed United States begged him to become their first president. Washington was essentially a reluctant executive. He despised political drama. He hated the backstabbing, the gossiping, and the endless bickering of politicians. In fact, he was completely repulsed by the idea of political factions. In his famous farewell address, Washington practically begged the American people not to form political parties. He warned them with astonishing accuracy that creating a two-party system would destroy the spirit of the nation, divide the citizens, and lead to toxic, hateful tribalism, where politicians would care more about defeating their rivals than helping the country. Of course, absolutely nobody listened to him. The very people sitting in his own cabinet, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, were already busy tearing each other apart and forming the exact toxic political parties Washington warned them about. It is almost painfully funny how accurate his prediction was. But Washington's absolute greatest achievement, his most spectacular contribution to modern democracy, was not something he did while in power. It was the moment he decided to give that power away. After serving 2 incredibly stressful terms as president, Washington was exhausted, old, and completely fed up with the political circus. The American people, however, adored him. They would have happily elected him for a third term, a fourth term, or let him rule as a king until the day he died. In a world entirely dominated by greedy monarchs, ruthless emperors, and power-hungry tyrants who fought to the death to keep their crowns, the idea of voluntarily walking away from absolute supreme power was completely unthinkable. It simply was not done. Yet, George Washington simply dropped the microphone. He packed up his things, said his goodbyes, and rode back to his farm at Mount Vernon. This single, unprecedented action stunned the entire globe. By refusing to hold on to power, he proved that the office of the presidency was greater than the man holding it. He established the vital democratic tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. When King George III of England, the very monarch Washington had defeated in the Revolutionary War, heard the rumor that Washington was planning to voluntarily step down, the king was in absolute disbelief. The king reportedly said that if Washington actually did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. And Washington did exactly that. So, what is the ultimate takeaway from the wild, painful, and surprisingly messy life of George Washington? History loves to put people on a pedestal. We love to scrub away the dirt, ignore the mistakes, and pretend that our heroes were flawless gods who descended from the heavens with perfect hair and perfect morals. But the truth is always so much better. George Washington was a profoundly flawed human being. He was a wealthy slave owner who participated in a brutal system. He accidentally started a massive global war because he was a hot-headed, inexperienced kid. He lost more battles than he won. He had horrific breath, wore the most terrifying dentures ever created, and spent most of his life wanting to avoid the very job that made him famous. But despite all of his massive shortcomings, he possessed an incredible, unbreakable resilience. He survived his own catastrophic mistakes. He held a starving, freezing army together through sheer force of will and a talent for running away. And when he was finally handed the keys to absolute, unquestioned power, he had the immense wisdom to hand them back. You do not need to be a perfect, mythical saint to change the world. You just need to learn from your monumental failures, keep your jaw clamped shut when things get tough, and know exactly when it is time to leave the stage. Thank you for tuning in to BrainBoost English Podcast. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment down below with your favorite weird historical fact, and keep learning English the fun way. See you in the next episode.